Good evening, everyone. I'm going to call this work session to order. If you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Commissioner Garrettson is absent tonight. Commissioner Andrews on the phone?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Okay, the first thing up is the Water Treatment Plan Facility Master Plan Update with Carollo Engineers. Adam?
All right, I'll do a quick introduction. So,
Okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. Just wanted to kind of recap real quick where we were and where we're at tonight. As you recall, at the February 25th work session, I gave a real overview. It's really, the intent was to be a summary of kind of where we were at with the plan. Engaged with Carollo last summer, and since that time, done quite a bit of work, a lot of fact finding, and now we're kind of at the point where we're getting into analyzing different alternatives and what those look like, and that's kind of the bulk of the presentation tonight. Introducing Ali Leeds, who's the lead project manager with Carollo, and then also in the audience is Laura Kamerick and Austin Peters. They're on the Carollo team as well, so happy to have them join us tonight. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Ali. We'll get started.
Perfect. So I have about probably 35 minutes of material up here, and feel free to ask questions as we go along, and if it's going to be answered on a later slide, I'll let you know that it's coming and you can hold it, or we'll circle back around if we need to. So as Adam mentioned, we're here to look at the facility plan and are helping CRW evaluate their water treatment plant. Just a reminder, and I think Adam brought this up at the previous session that he went over, but the purpose of this plan overall is to evaluate the water treatment plant capacity, current and future capacity and demands on it, identify potential deficiencies that there may be at the treatment plant, and then recommend some improvements to address those deficiencies. So we're going to actually basically kind of go through all of those elements here tonight and talk a little bit about all of them. So down below that, the agenda, where we're going, we're going to start with just an overview, get the lay of the land, and then walk through the drivers for doing improvements at the treatment plant, talk about some options then to address some of those drivers, and then implementing those in alternatives, and then finish up with the selection criteria for how you go about selecting the alternatives or how they look in comparison to each other, and wrap up with next steps. So I wanted to start off, just make sure we're all on the same page with the treatment plant itself and what's out there. And what we've got is a schematic here along the bottom of the treatment plant process, and then an aerial view of the treatment plant itself. So the treatment plant, we pull in water from the Clackamas River through an intake, so located out in the river there. And water gets pulled in through a low-lift pump station into the treatment plant. So pulling in water, pumping it up, and going into contact basins at the treatment plant. After flowing through the contact basins, flows into filters, and then on into the clear well, which is where disinfection is done, chlorine disinfection done in the clear well at the back end. And then there's a high lift pump station there right next to the clear well that sends the water out into the distribution system. There's a few other elements to the treatment plant that aren't in that main picture on the bottom, and the first is this box down here, the solids handling. And you can imagine, we're pulling water out of the river, we remove stuff from the water, turbidity, other components in the water, and that stuff gets handled then in the solids handling piece to the plant. So it's critically important, but it doesn't appear in the main process stream. And then some other buildings that are up there are supporting infrastructure. So you need to add some chemicals to the water, you need to have power and controls, and so that's in the buildings that are also around in that same general area. And over to the side, there's a few maintenance buildings and some operations buildings as well on site. So that's kind of the overview of the water treatment plant as it stands now. The other overview I wanted to give you was a few kind of fine print items, or just on some cost estimates. So we're going to talk about some costs tonight a little bit, but all these costs are very high level. So when we think about the accuracy range that we're assuming that goes with these costs, plus 50% to minus 30%. So when we give you a number, it can go up or down significantly at this point, just because of a very limited definition. So what you are going to see is that in terms of cost estimates, when we look at these options and alternatives, there's capital costs in them, and then some operations and maintenance costs. And the different options have different capital and different operations and maintenance. So we combine those together to allow a comparison in a 50-year net present value. So that's kind of the background on stuff. So now I'm going to lead into drivers for plant improvements. So, what are we looking at the plant that might potentially need to be improved? And so in looking at the plant, we came across that there were basically 4 different elements that were drivers for doing plant improvements. These drivers are capacity, water quality, age, and hazards. So I'm going to start first with the capacity piece. So the capacity piece, looking at this graph here, I think what we want to look at is this kind of mustard line or this yellow line, which is a max day demand on it for the water treatment plant. So if we're looking as you go across the years, the max day demand is increasing, and you have some jumps as different parts of the system are being introduced. So as you're adding south system and as you're selling more to wholesalers, you end up increasing that demand. So this is the maximum demand on a given day. And then that purple line that's up there, we've got it labeled water treatment plant firm capacity. So this line across here at 24 MGD. And what that line represents is the capacity that the water treatment plant can push through like on a continuous basis. So if you have to run at that capacity for several days in a row, say you're having like a hot summer day or a hot summer week, and so you have to run at a high capacity several days in a row, that's the number that your plant is fixed at for its firm capacity. It could temporarily maybe push a little more water through, but it can't do it on a continuous basis, multiple days in a row. So as you can see, we end up crossing, those demands end up crossing the capacity that's available at the water treatment plant. And on the numbers that we've got on here and kind of projecting forward, it's around 2026, the number we're looking at. So there's a driver to do some improvement to want to push that purple line up higher. So push out the date, push that purple line up higher. The next driver element that we wanted to look at was aging infrastructure at the existing plant. So looking at the aerial that's up here, highlighted the core of the plant, that main piece of the plant, was all built in 1964. So that piece of the plant right now is 55 years old. The plant then was added on about 10 years later. So the next kind of basins and the other contact basin up at the top, 45 years old. And then there were a couple of filters added on in 1992. So we're just under 30 years old. And then there have been some other miscellaneous projects, and they're kind of in the lighter colors around, and those have been done in the past 20 years. But overall, if we're looking at your treatment plant and the general age of the core of everything, right now, everything in yellow there, the main heart of the plant, is, about 55 years old. So is getting older, getting up there in age. And I want to tie that to, or think about that, right in parallel with the seismic resiliency, or the Oregon Resilience Plan. And putting these together, because the seismic resilience, the goal with the Oregon Resilience Plan was to have some resilient system in place by 2063. So when we're looking at this aging infrastructure, how your plant's going to age over time, this is a number of years out. And so we say, well, what does it mean to make something seismically resilient? When we're in 2063, what will we still have around that we would have wanted to make seismically resilient for that 2063 date? And so to look at that, like what is still going to need to be around in 2063, we pulled some approximate useful life numbers up here. These are from EPA guidance document. So in useful life numbers, concrete structures, they say 70 years. This doesn't mean at 70 years of age they go out and fall down. It just means that as you continue to repair them, it becomes more expensive to repair them than it may be worth if you just built something new at that point. So we're calling it end of useful life. So if we step along the useful life, that main heart of the plant, the concrete structures that were the main heart, reach that end of useful life, that 70 years in 2034. Then if you step out to the next set of basins that are out there, they age out in 2044. And pipelines coming into the plant are 2054. And then the last little part, the filters up there, are 2062. So the overall summary of it is, if we're thinking about this, trying to consider each of these, trying to make them a seismically resilient element, by the time we get out to 2063, they will have gone past the end of their useful life, most of the infrastructure that's in there. So really, when we're thinking about these two pieces together, if we're going to take this aging infrastructure and start replacing it, when you put something new out there, go and build a new building, it's going to be to current seismic code. And so you achieve this seismic resiliency in that structure, as well as achieving, not having that age driver in there. So they go hand in hand because of the age of your water treatment plant and this whole core of your plant being the age that it is right now. So we've got these two, the seismic piece and the aging piece really together. So the last driver up here, and the driver I'm going to spend a bit of time on because it provides the options that we're really talking about comparing, is water quality. And so in water quality, we went out at the beginning of this plan and reviewed water quality data and looked at your watershed and risks, what the water was susceptible to, what your watershed was susceptible to. And in meeting with your staff and discussing it, it's identified that there were 4 contaminants of focus that we wanted to think about how your system would handle these, or how your water treatment plant would handle these. And right now in the existing plant, there aren't processes to be able to treat them adequately. So yeah, we came up with this high in legend on here, but overall you can see is, in the existing plant, so our first one up there is high turbidity. So, got high turbidity or a lot of, mud or dirt in the river water coming in. We don't have the capability to deal with that. Algal toxins and taste and odor. And we've lumped these two together because they often are promoted by the same sort of elements in water, higher temperatures or nutrients in the water, and the treatment tends to be pretty much the same on both of those. So we lump them together. The same thing's going to treat both of those. Elevated TOC. TOC stands for total organic carbon, and this is something that's naturally occurring. Carbon is in the leaves and in your watershed around, and so it's in and of itself isn't bad, and you've got low levels in your water right now, and that's perfectly fine, perfectly normal. But what happens is if you add chlorine to it, so when we chlorinate our drinking water, it forms disinfection byproducts. And disinfection byproducts are regulated, and so you don't want to form too many of them. So we've got this keyword in here, elevated, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But the last piece on here that I want to point out was pharmaceuticals and personal care products. And this is a big cluster of items, of constituents that could be in the water, but it's anything that, coming down out of wastewater sources in general. So in thinking about these, we wanted to think about these in terms of risk, or, when do these occur, how likely are they to occur? And we know some of these, like your high turbidity, you tend to see high turbidity every year for periodic episodes in your river. So it is something seasonal, something you see in storm events that come through all the time. Something like algal toxins and taste and odor, those have a particular window when they could potentially occur. And so we know that potentially occurring is spring through fall. The elevated TOC that we were looking at here, so we said you have low levels right now. The elevated piece would come if you had, for example, a fire in your watershed. So, you have some results, some impact on the water quality that comes out of your watershed, and that could tend to elevate the TOC. But so we wouldn't expect it unless you had some event that precipitated that occurring. And then the pharmaceuticals and personal care products, that comes through upstream wastewater discharges. So tends to be in many water bodies. You do have some upstream wastewater discharges, but they occur in very low levels and are not a regulated compound, at least at this point. So there is some scale of the risk of when they're going to occur and how long they're going to occur, whether they're going to occur, associated with each of those.
So can I, any question, I mean, the water quality component is a big piece of this, and we're gonna go into, Ally's gonna go into more information about the different treatment processes and stuff, but just kind of having that baseline understanding, I wanna make sure we're okay understanding these are the constituents that we've identified, and if there's any questions about that.
Well, how are we now with these?
So, if you go, yeah.
Well, that, yeah, but I mean,
So fortunately, we have a really good source,
Yeah.
a supply, and so that's been, one of the things that's been very, very beneficial for us. Obviously, we hope to continue to have a really good source of supply, however, as Ally will talk about, there's gonna be some additional challenges in the future and some things that we're aware of that we wanna try to get ahead of the game.
well, I get the upstream wastewater discharge, and of course the seasonal stuff, I mean, that's obviously a watershed. The toxins and stuff, Suzanne's always on top of that, so I really, I mean,
Well,
it doesn't seem.
We're on top of it as far as detecting it, but this is dealing with treating it. So,
Okay.
so just because you know it's there, when you know it's there, you gotta treat it. So that's the important piece.
That's important,
So we're
okay.
talking about treatment,
Okay.
so, great,
Yeah.
good question. Okay, sorry.
No, perfect.
No, thanks.
I think
Thank you, Ally.
So as part of the work that we've done, we got together and looked and did a high-level screening on treatment alternatives, different ways to go about treating the contaminants, of focus in here. And we narrowed it down from a whole group to, I'll say like 3 groups of treatment options up there. And we've shown here where the treatment options would fit into the existing process. But the main takeaway from the slide to look at or to notice is that there's no one of these treatment options that treats all the contaminants of concern. So what you'll see in general is that ozone and powdered activated carbon treat the 3 at this end, and clarification's the one that gives you the full glass on the high turbidity end. You can't achieve all 4 of those without having multiple combinations. So really, if we want to get all 4 of those, or have the option to treat all 4 of those, you need some combination of the 2. So what I'm going to do then is dig in a little bit more into these options. We're going to look at clarification first and talk about a couple options for clarification. So there's a couple different ways we could do that. And then we're going to come back and look at this powdered activated carbon as compared to ozone and the differences between those 2. So the clarification options, there's a range of options out there, but in doing a high-level screening, we were looking at which ones make the most sense for your plant and your water quality, and settled on 2 different options. This first one, and I'll tend to fall back into calling it plates, or you'll see it abbreviated as plates throughout the presentation, because this is a fairly long flocculation sedimentation basin with plate settlers is the full name, but plates for short. And so it's open basin with some plates in it that help basically to pull out the dirt, the high turbidity that comes in from the river water. On the other end of it, we have ballasted flocculation. And this is the technology that Lake Oswego Tigard has at their water treatment plant. It's a little bit different because it's a little bit smaller footprint than you would have with the plates. And then it has a sand that you add to it to make the dirt settle faster in the water. So you can have that's what gets you the smaller footprint, and you can push water through it faster.
Sorry.
Yeah,
It
no.
looked like you were click forward. So can I ask you what the benefits of each one would be? You know, why did they go with the BF and not the plates, aside from cost? Were there other reasons that they chose that path?
Yeah, so I think a large, well, and I can, Austin can speak to this, he did a lot of the design out there, but a lot of it had to do with footprint. This one is substantially smaller in size, and so they're very land-wise, they were driven to wanting to compact down the water treatment plant site. So I think on theirs largely, anything else besides
Yeah,
the
and you'll actually, we got some layouts in a little bit, and you'll see the footprint differences on the
Okay.
site layout. And, you know, you guys have quite a bit of space here at the CRW plant, so there's not as much of a driver. Certainly Lake Oswego was all about, they just had a tiny amount of space.
Okay.
Is there one better than the other? Or is it
They're
of
both
size?
capable of treating the water.
Size is the
equally
component.
sized as the one, and you can see also the O&M cost difference.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Because you add more chemical at basketball, you add sand, you add some polymers, and so the cost is more expensive just to run it.
What's O&M?
Operations and maintenance.
Okay, okay.
So ongoing cost, that's an annual
Got it.
ongoing cost.
Okay. The one, there's no life expectancy difference between each one.
No, there are, I mean, they all have motors and these will have motors that drive the guides that move sludge out of it. So, I mean, overall, it's some limited mechanical equipment, but concrete structures and base equipment are gonna be about the same. And so and the capital cost, so coming back to the capital cost numbers that are up there, as I said at the beginning, right now we're at a very high level of definition. So really when we're looking at the upper and lower ends of these ranges, these are all really overlapping in the ranges very much at this level. So, you know, the devil's in the details. Once you get to flushing it out, that number can go up or down depending on what other elements need to go into those basins itself. But very similar from a capital cost, but as Austin pointed out, that O&M cost is higher with the valsted flocculation. Anything else on the clarification piece?
What about the retrofitting and the new? Obviously, there's a price difference, but what would be, again, is it the same life expectancy, the same quality?
Perfect, no, so yeah, this is, and thank you for pointing that out, I meant to mention, the retrofit into the existing is you have those existing contact basins, and so we looked at it and said, okay, we could go put plates in those existing contact basins. However, the plates also have, there's some mixers that end up needing to be in a basin up front, and you don't have quite enough basin space. So you end up, the retrofit is partially new structure, partially old structure. But part of this, and back to the aging infrastructure, is that concrete has some life expectancy, and so if we put that in there, that doesn't mean that you get to start over at zero age. It is putting it into something that is aging on.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
The new basin is assuming the whole structure is new.
Okay.
So you can see there is a cost savings to it, but it isn't.
Upfront,
It's-
but again, the life
yes.
expectancy of it.
Well,
Yep.
and then also realize that one of the things we talked about was the seismic resiliency. So
Yeah.
obviously the new would be built to a more seismic resilient standard versus relying on the retrofit to the existing, which we know is not.
All right, so these are the clarification options that we're going to take on and look at in a little more detail. And then I want to talk a little bit about ozone versus powder activated carbon. And these are, I'll say, very sort of different looking treatment alternatives with some very different costs associated with them. On the ozone side of things, ozone is a gas that you generate on site and you inject it into the process stream. It's something that gets used year round. So when we were looking at that process flow schematic that you had on there, ozone would become a process that would be in that process flow schematic for your treatment plant. It becomes a part of your treatment plant that's always there. It's a treatment process, another barrier that you put in. Powdered activated carbon is more like a chemical on the side. It's a powder that you mix with water and you add it in when you have an issue, so periodically, not all the time. And then you need to settle it out again. Just like turbidity, when you have mud in the water, essentially you're adding this fine powder that you need to settle out. So looking down at the bottom, you can see in these two processes, the capital cost of ozone is substantially more. We do have generation, a building that has generating equipment, and then basins associated with it that contribute to the higher capital cost. The pack on the other side of it, the capital cost for it tends to be stored in a building, and you mix it up in tanks when you need to, or have it delivered on site when you need to. On the opposite end of this is the O&M cost. You can see the O&M cost for that pack is substantially higher than the O&M cost for ozone. And I want to come back to this O&M cost right here. So we said pack is something that you add when you need it, when you decide you need it. So when we're guessing on an annual basis how much that cost is going to be, we have to make an assumption on how often you're going to have to add it. And so this O&M cost in here is assuming that you need to add it for 60 days a year. So that's that basis.
I have a question
Yes,
from the
ma'am.
phone. So what are we using right now? I mean, we're getting these two costs, but what do we have right now?
We don't have either of these.
You don't have either of those, okay.
Correct.
So this is something we would be adding, thank you.
Correct.
To accomplish the goal of having full glasses on all of those.
Right,
Right. To
yep.
help with the water quality.
Right.
So, yeah, just to clarify real quick, we do have PAC today,
Well,
but not with the capability to add the volume we're talking here. We have a very,
Okay,
right, Rob? Very small, limited system that really doesn't affect what we would need it to in these terms, so.
So going back
just
to
qualify.
the ozone, that's a gas you said that is generated on site. So
Mhm.
we wouldn't need to continue purchasing something like the pack, because that needs to be, that's,
So it gets generated from oxygen, so you do have to have oxygen delivered to the
Okay.
site associated with it.
Okay.
So you store bulk oxygen on the site, you know, like in the tanks that you'd see at hospitals, store bulk oxygen tanks, so similar sort of
Okay.
thing, you store oxygen and then generate it off of
so
oxygen.
let's just say the big earthquake hits and we have either one of these set up, and how long can we go? Like how much can we store on site and continue to keep the water quality safe before we need to get more? And so which one could we keep longer?
And it's really, ultimately, it could be a policy question on how big you wanna size the tanks, how much you wanna storage it. You know, ultimately a decision, how big do we want to make the storage to last something? How many days do you want it to go for?
So how many days would we look at? Just, come on, guesstimate, Adam or Todd?
So, we usually say kind of as a throwout number, average storage is no less than 15 days if you're sizing, and then there's some max and min numbers that you don't wanna go between, you know, 30 days storage, or sorry, average 30 days of storage, max and min 15. And then I think some other plants in Oregon are doing like 5 days.
Well,
Is that-
so the Willamette Water Supply Program for their new water treatment plant that they're building in Sherwood, their minimum stored chemical, as I always think, that's the stored volume, like the total volume you can have. They also have an operational metric that they're applying to that plant where they will always have 5 days. You know, so that they will call and order a new chemical when they get down to that, when they get down to a minimum number that is 5 days of storage, and so then they'll re-out from there back to the 30 days.
Okay.
But again, it's
so I have another question. Since we don't have either the ozone or we have a lower level of PAC right now, so we're saying is that we must add one of these two to keep everything at the level that we need it. Is that what we're saying?
we're saying in order to address water quality,
Yes.
items, so there's things, you go through this in more detail as it relates to, some of the water quality issues. So for instance, for cyanotoxins, ozone and PAC are two things that are very helpful if you're encountering those.
Okay.
What
And
about
then
PFAS?
taste and odor, issue. PFAS, I'll kick to you guys.
So, yeah, so I know it's been in the news and all over a lot lately, but it tends to be, so it's a compound that's really resilient and is really associated with point sources. So when you see it places where it's occurred, it's because there was a legacy, like an Air Force base, like JBLM has some downstream wells, or there was a firefighting school, something there. So really it tends to be something it's associated with a source, and so if it isn't there already, you know, it isn't something like we can have a wildfire and it's gonna show up, you know, in fire retardants, you need to have a concentrated source to really be of the
Okay.
impact. So
Okay.
while it is all over and it is a concern in a number of areas, we wouldn't tend to say or recommend trying to install the higher technology for it, just because you don't have the risk factors that seem to indicate that it would be a problem in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, did that?
That was great.
So what we're trying to do in thinking about the costs and the risk as well, so coming back to this risk is, you know, what is the risk that you're gonna have something, this cost, you know, we said 60 days a year, what is, you know, the risk that this is gonna occur that 60 days or longer through the year, or less, and what does that mean for us? And So when we're thinking about something like algal toxins and taste and odor, and this is one that we're really, focusing on now because taste and odor have been a challenge in the past, and algal toxins are certainly something that we're aware of and are a possibility on the horizon. That's something that the time frame is potentially spring through fall. So that's your algal season. So if you were to have a big bloom event like Salem had, I think they started adding PAC in May maybe and went through September. So that's 4 months out of the year. So that's definitely more than what we're assuming in this cost. But there may be years where you don't have any issues at all and you don't turn it on. So then if you don't have PAC delivered, then that O&M cost is much, much less. So there is this unknown that's hard to predict on exactly what that's going to mean. And we'll come back to combining that O&M cost. I want to do a little bit of sensitivity coming up in some slides as to what that means.
Joe, the main point from that slide, the distinction, which Ali will go into more detail, is on the ozone, you're having that treatment 24/7 as you're operating the plant. So every bit of water that's going through is getting that treatment. On the PAC, you're only treating when you think you need it. So you're gonna have some water that's not gonna go through that PAC process. So it's a little bit more, I don't know if it's safe to say, it's a little more reactive as opposed to ozone. That's just part of your treatment process. And ozone's a powerful disinfectant that has all of these other qualities, so.
So, yeah, I'm going to come to that. I have a good list that has that same, and that's, one of the other pieces that I want to point out is about land utilization on these. So the image on the left, the one that we're labeling ozone, we said in the future the plant needs to produce more water. We need to move that line up. And so when you produce more water, then there's more turbidity, more stuff that comes out. So we need to add more capacity to the solids handling when we go up in capacity at the treatment plant. So on the ozone side, ozone doesn't introduce anything else that causes solids in the water. So the yellow infrastructure that would be added to the solids handling down here is infrastructure that's just associated with going up with more flow through the plant. So needing to process more solids from the river itself. Whereas if we come over to the PAC alternative, the PAC, remember, we're adding this charcoal to the water, but then it's a one-use thing. We have to pull the charcoal back out and it becomes a solid itself that we need to process. So you can see there's additional infrastructure that we need to add on the solids handling side to handle the solids that we're adding to the water to pull out stuff. So in here, this land use is based off of 60 days of PAC as well. You can imagine more usage means more land requirements, and down to something like this that's just a capacity driven one at your current loading rates.
There goes the baseball field.
And the red lines that are on there, so there's some red lines that are a little bit hard to see, but those are the approximate boundaries of what CRW owns. So I wanted to do a few more comparisons on ozone versus PAC, just because they are very different treatment approaches or carry different benefits and different costs associated with them. And the first, and I think you actually use these exact words, and this is how we think it, ozone is a proactive approach that's always in there, and it is a barrier. And we call it, in the water treatment business, we say a multi-barrier approach to stuff. It's a barrier that's in your treatment plant to treat contaminants. PAC is a reactive response, in that when you start to have an issue, somebody notices that the water has a taste or odor or something a little bit unusual, then that would trigger you to start getting PAC going and add it to the system. In terms of water quality impacts, because your ozone is now part of the process, you get year-round benefits from it. And I'll come back to the benefits in just a second. Whereas you don't if you're using something intermittent like PAC. On the staff impact side, and particularly over here under PAC, so PAC is this powder that you have to add, and so you have to store it. It's very fine, and you have to wear a respirator if you're going to handle it, just because it's such a fine powder. And when you add it to the water, it clumps, and it's not pleasant to use. But so it ends up being what we say challenging and unpleasant to operate on the staff side. On the environmental impacts, you asked about what went into the ozone LOX. So this is liquid oxygen, is LOX abbreviation there. We do have to have LOX, and we do use energy for generation on it. So that is one of the pieces to ozone, whereas better activated carbon, it's pretty low energy. But you saw the land use and the solids associated with it. On the process impact side, so ozone actually has a pretty synergistic effect with treatment processes that are even at your plant right now. So what we call pre-treatment or filters. Plants will actually see if they have an ozone system. If the ozone system is shut off for some period of time for any reason, they'll see the rest of their processes go down in performance a little bit. Their filter runs won't be as long, or they won't get quite as good coagulation. So it actually has some benefits in improving other processes when you implement it. Whereas PAC, when you add it, we said it's like you're adding turbidity to the water, so you do have to get it pulled out again. So you have to actually make sure you pull it out, otherwise it causes problems in your filters. And this is one of the limitations or challenges now out at the plant. We said we have PAC at the plant now, but that settling isn't quite sufficient to pull it back out, so it creates downstream problems. But the big one, and coming down to the bottom, are the cost implications and the difference between these two. Right, ozone has that higher capital cost, and it has ongoing operations costs. Whereas PAC has lower capital cost, and if you don't ever use it, it costs very little in O&M if you're never using it. When you do use it, it does cost more. So you're playing the risk cost benefit game. How often are we going to use it, and how long are we going to use it for? So to put some actual numbers to it. So we said there was the clarification piece and the PAC versus ozone piece. And so we're going to combine those in some treatment options up here. And so I'm going to start by pointing out the three to the right up here. So this is, we said in clarification there was the ballasted flock, the plates in existing basins, and the plates in new basins. And so these are those clarification options paired with ozone. So the three on the right. And then the two on the left are plates with PAC. And we only have two of them because ballasted flock is such a small footprint, the water moves through it quickly. The PAC itself needs some contact time, so it doesn't work to actually pair the PAC with a ballasted flock. Those two processes, you won't get the benefits out of those. So that's why we don't have a PAC ballasted flock option. So right now we're looking at capital costs, and so you can see overall in the capital costs, the capital cost of the ozone options is a higher cost in there. So now if we look to the axis on the right side, annual O&M cost, and this is referring to the yellow bars up there. O&M costs, we said on the PAC side, were substantially higher, even at 60 days per year. So your O&M costs, the highest yellow bars up there, your ozone costs lower. And so now combining the two together for net present value, this middle blue one, and that's off the axis on the left. Net present value of the alternatives, you can see the PAC options, the two left options, tend to be a little less on net present value than the options to the right that are a little bit higher. Now all these net present value do depend on that O&M piece, that 60 days a year. So this, we wanted to look a little bit at, so what does it mean if you were to go up above that 60 days per year or down below? How sensitive are we to that? What's associated with that? So 60 days per year is right in the middle of this analysis here. And so we have two different bars up there. One bar is if you're using the existing basins, and one bar is if you do new basins. But they're all using PAC, what's up here. So you can see if we were to take it down and we were to say, okay, we're going to use PAC 0 days per year. That 50-year net present value, of course, doesn't go to zero because you had to build the infrastructure for the PAC itself, which is some of it, but then we had the solids handling pieces, the extra land use that had to be built out, those other yellow squares on the footprint. So it doesn't go to zero, but it does go down if we don't end up using it at all. If we were to go to the opposite end and say, we want to use PAC like you do ozone, we want a barrier that's there all the time, treating the water 365 days a year, and you can see the net present value cost tends to go substantially higher. If I throw in the ozone costs, so these are the net present value lines for ozone, and ozone's operating all the time, so these are just continuous lines across at the different costs. If you go up to 365 days a year of getting treatment, you can see it's substantially higher if you're doing it with PAC than if you're doing it with ozone. So we've done our analysis here at the 60 days, where the net present value is a little less. If we were to bump it up at 90 days, net present values would be about the same. and then anything over that, you're gonna be higher. So, questions about the sensitivity analysis or the numbers?
Breathe, Naomi.
So
So the bottom,
I had a question about the previous slide. It said summary of treatment options, comparative costs. Can you remind me what the 50-year NPV stands for? I've got I know what the capital cost and the OMA cost is, but what's that blue line?
Sure, so that's combining the different capital costs. So we're taking what it costs to build, the capital costs, and then adding basically 50 years of O&M onto that. So if you're gonna
Okay,
continue.
I got it. Yeah, okay. And so in this NPV sensitivity analysis, what we're saying is, depends on how often we're using the PAC to which one is more financially viable, I suppose. So,
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you.
How often do we use it now?
We haven't used it in a few years.
We haven't?
We're not,
Well, I'm
but
just,
our water cup is,
yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
it
Empty.
binds your filters up, right, so you don't really have, you can't add it because it will disrupt the rest of your process. I mean, it's there, but it's not there very effectively.
okay.
I'll say it this way, and Rob, you can tell me if this is wrong, but we have the ability to add, but we don't have the ability to allow it to be fully effective.
Oh,
You could say you can take the edge off taste and odor, but you're not gonna remove it. You can lower it, but you're not removing it.
Okay.
So what-
And the objective is to remove it.
Right. So we're reluctant to use it because it's a real, from an operational standpoint, it's a real challenge. And we don't get the full effect given our current configuration.
We add it
Is that
with our
fair?
chlorine, we also add it with our chlorine, and it absorbs chlorine, so
Yeah.
kind of fighting a losing battle. that way.
Oh, okay.
seems redundant.
Okay. So we wanted to take the options, we've got the treatment options of how you go about treating this water and take it into implementation alternatives. So how would these be implemented at the plant and what would that mean? What does that look like? And so in looking at those, we wanted to capture a spectrum of ways that you could go about doing this, so you'd have some bookends to think through on this. And the first one is that existing plant focus. So we could do an implementation alternative where we were going to focus on retrofitting and rehabbing what you have there to the maximum extent possible. So we're going to look at an alternative where we're going to see, we're going to put everything into the existing plant and try to avoid doing new stuff as much as possible. We could go to the opposite end and say, okay, new plant focus. What if we say that the old plant is aging out and we want to know what is it going to take if we just went somewhere else adjacent and just built everything completely new. So opposite end of the extreme. And under that, this is alternative 3. We did a couple of subcategories so you could see the plates with PAC is one and the ozone with ballasted floc is the other under that alternative. And then we wanted to pick one somewhere in the middle, of course, which we're calling incremental construction of new infrastructure. So the idea being, we'll do it near where your existing plant is and around some components, but rather than focusing on making the existing components do what they need to do, we'll build new components and work them in with the existing as it makes sense. So incremental construction, and there's a couple of sub-components or sub alternatives under that. Again, one with plates and PAC and one with ozone and ballasted floc. So 3 alternatives, kind of figuring different ways of thinking about how we're going to implement those. And what you're going to see is within each of these alternatives, so within each 1, 2, 3, there are these phases that we're going to build infrastructure.
Are you gonna show us
Mm-hmm.
number 3, where that would go if we went with that?
Yep.
Okay.
And the phases within each of these alternatives, the first phase that we're looking at building is the water quality phase. So how do you address the water quality driver challenges? And then the next phase of build addresses your capacity challenges. in general, so how do we take it up to get the capacity needed? Any additional phases that are in there, phases that would be built for aging infrastructure, seismic resiliency, and then an optional phase at the end. So we're marching our way through the various drivers kind of as they occur in time. So starting with alternative one up there is the existing plant focus, and that's where we want to maximize the use of existing infrastructure. So that first phase, at phase one, we're looking at building for water quality. You can see we're to take and put plates in the existing basins that are there, build some additional flocculation basins off the front, and then this is a pack building off to the side. So adding pack with existing basins to make that work. Then when we go on to do capacity improvements, so at a later build-out phase, because we've added pack, we need to add substantially more solids handling down at the end. But we add the solids handling, and there's also some limits on your filters up there. So adding new filter on that same site. And then we're going to start on to the other remaining drivers that are down here, these other phases. And this is an example of an option that you could do would be, okay, so now we're going to build a clear well over the top. We're going to get rid of the building that was here, that was an operations building, and build a new clear well over there, which then lets you take out the old clear well and start to build a chemical building and an admin building there. And then at that point, we will have aged out on the contact basins that you retrofit, and they will have aged out, so we'll need to, at that point, build some new pretreatment. This is ballasted flocculation that we're showing, and so then you can demo the old part and put in new filters, and ultimately stepping all the way out to finish the pipeline, and then you've got a complete plant in there that has all the drivers. We've just kind of marched through a scenario of how you could potentially go building out stuff if your first steps are the water quality of retrofitting in the existing basins, kind of what it looks like. The green phase, this phase X, what we said is optional. This is leaving space for ozone here, so if you were to put in pack first and decide, another 20 years down the line that you wanted to put in ozone, there would still be footprint, and this makes sense from a layout point of view that you could put ozone there. And this is mechanical dewatering over there. And again, another option that, well, where would you put it in the future, and where does it make sense? There would be space over there.
Mechanical what?
Mechanical dewatering, and that's something that it handles solids,
Oh, okay.
but it's you don't need it. But if you ever decide, at least at this point, there's no driver for it. But if you ever decided you wanted to get a smaller footprint, it lets you achieve a smaller footprint essentially of all the elements down here. You can fit them all in some little buildings, but it has a pretty substantial price tag. So it's there. It's there if you need it in the future, and that's where it would make sense to put it, just as a plan of what could be done.
The Lake Oswego plant has mechanical.
Oh,
dewatering.
okay.
Again,
Yeah,
yeah,
we're gonna
footprint
see.
driven, and
Do they have ozone as well?
yeah, they do.
Just as the Willamette plant in Wilsonville has both of those too.
We move over to alternative 2A. So alternative 2A, this is an incrementally replacing. So both the alternative 2s are incremental replacements. But 2A is the one that we're going to put in plates and pack. So what we're showing here is rather than putting the plates in the existing basins, we're going to build a separate structure off to the side that is essentially new plate basins. So new plates over on the side here, and then a pack system to add to the plates that are over there. So that's how you address the water quality portion of it. And then the capacity portion of it looks very similar to alternative 1. Build some solids handling and build filters. And then as you march through the other 3 phases to achieve your aging infrastructure and resiliency, it's just like the other alternative where you demo some buildings and replace on the same site in the footprint of others as time wore on, until you ultimately had a configuration where all your buildings were up there on site. Again, we've reserved space for a phase X, which is an optional version, and that's ozone up there. So you can see, because we started out with a little bit different layout at the beginning, because our first step looked a little different, the final configuration looks a little bit different, but reserving ozone and mechanical dewatering space. If we did ballasted flocculation, Ballasted flocculation has ozone with it, so you're doing the two at the same time. So this is clarification with ballasted flocculation and ozone, and those are the first pieces that are built. And then as we go to get our capacity improvements, we do the solids portions, but it's less solids because we aren't building for pack now. We've installed ozone, so there's less yellow now, and we need to build out for capacity. And then ultimately we march through the phases 3, 4, and 5, just like we did on the other options. So replacing the buildings where they, as you age out on site, and then carefully demoing out as it makes sense. At the end of alternative 2B though, the difference is the green, your optional phases, is less because we already built ozone. We built ozone at the first part. So it's not an optional piece anymore. It's already there.
Can I ask, I maybe missed it, why the yellow additional basins down there, why those are gone now?
So this
Yeah.
was if you were to build mechanical dewatering in the future, they
Okay.
would be gone.
The mechanical dewatering, that wasn't in here, right? We haven't seen any pricing for that, or?
No, and we could take a guess at it, but it's substantially higher cost and no driver for it at this point.
Okay.
So the preferred option, the yellow version is the preferred option, which is a lower cost consistent with what your operating system is now on things.
Okay. But you're just showing us that in case the future we wanna do.
Right, so if, say, 60 years down the line, something in our distant horizon, you want this land for something else, this is where you could put mechanical dewatering, for example. You could go out and build this infrastructure and then recover this land for some other use.
Okay.
So it's just in laying it out, we wanted to keep in mind, not boxing you in on where your alternatives could go in the future. Where would it make sense to put things so that you had room in the future to move things around as needed. I mean, this isn't the end-all be-all of everything.
Yeah. If you wanted, I mean, you could put mechanical dewatering in early in the process.
Yep.
The problem is it's very expensive. And then that would avoid the expansion of the settlement basins.
The Lake Oswego did it.
Because they had site
So they had
constraints.
to do it.
And
is
so
that-
they didn't have
okay.
room.
Yeah.
So that was
We-
their driver.
They didn't
One
have
of our
room
fortunate
to
things,
go
We have
out.
a lot of property.
We have
And
a
so-
park right next door, right?
Well, we have the park
Yeah.
and we have
Yeah.
the property up above
Yeah.
and everything else too, so.
Ally, if I may, on the solid, absolutely right. The reason Lake Oswego went was a footprint issue. The other reason utilities, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, choose mechanical dewatering, especially recently, is that the existing system relies on environmental factors to dry the solids, via solar drying in the sun. And mechanical dewatering does not rely on that, does not rely on a nice hot summer to dry solids and those types of things. And so some utilities choose to put in mechanical dewatering at the higher expense, so they're not reliant on having a dry summer, and they can dewater their solids any time of the year, whenever they need to.
Yeah, we're talking Oregon here. but
It's an operational decision as well as a footprint decision. So that's why we wanted to always reserve space for you to do it if you ever needed to, but not necessarily recommend it right away.
So the settling basin process, what we use today, it's technology, it's used, Joint Water Commission out in Hillsborough uses it, they just went through a big expansion. You're seeing other facilities that have a tighter footprint that are going more to the mechanical right off the bat. Yeah, so.
Okay, so moving over to the new plant focus, and you asked about where the new plant would go. So this is a little bit more zoomed out view. So up here, this red property line continues up and goes around some property that's up to the northeast side. And this property right now is cleared, and it's where the solids that you pull out of here ultimately end up over in that property.
So it's already clear. We wouldn't be taking down trees and.
No, some.
And we've pushed them up as far as we can to keep it out of.
Trees are important.
Yes.
So it is, but it is shown up in the cleared area up here at the top. And so in this case, if we were going to go build a new plant elsewhere, which is being up in the top corner up there, we would start off with installing, and this is option A up here, we're gonna put in plates and we're gonna put in packs, so you get water quality off the bat. But we're also basically building half of a new plant, so you get your capacity improvements with the first go, with our first build of stuff. What you will see though is there's a lot more buildings up here, because when you go to build a new plant, now you do need to install your chemical systems and your control systems and your electrical systems with the plant up there as well. So there ends up being a number of other buildings that have to accompany that first round of buildings. So the phase 1 buildings, there's a lot more of them under these alternatives. The phase 2 piece, which is the capacity piece, then becomes building the other half of the plant to take it up to essentially a 30 MGD plant. And once you hit phase 2, that's pretty much it. There's a little bit down on the intake right here, and we've reserved space for optional, but there's no 3, 4, or 5 up there, because when you've built a whole new plant, your aging infrastructure and your resiliency are already addressed. So you're achieving all the drivers much earlier if you do it with an alt 3, but you're building all this infrastructure right from the get-go. So this up here, what we've got shown is 3A, and 3B is essentially the same thing, but doing ballasted flock and ozone. So rather than re-step through everything, it's just a box showing the same footprint that would occur up there.
So 3B is with ozone,
Mhm.
3A is with PAC.
Yep.
Okay.
So one thing to, oh,
No, go
so
ahead.
one thing to note, I apologize if I keep jumping ahead, is, again, the first phase of the construction of a new plant isn't the entire plant, and so you'd still, we're still assuming you'd still be reliant on the old plant for some peaking
Correct,
during
yep.
the summer. So
That
you'd
first
still be-
phase, you still need the old plant.
Yeah.
For
So,
how long?
until we grow into the demand.
Till you build the other
Okay.
half of the
Probably
plant.
about
And
the other half of the plant.
Okay.
Mhm.
How long would that take to build it?
Depends how much water we sell to
Part of it's funding too.
folks.
Funding?
and-
Okay, so you kind of have to go along with, so Carol?
How much can you dig up, Carol?
Yeah, what can we afford?
I mean, the idea is you would utilize the old plant, right, for another X number of years to peak, as was just described, and then build out the remaining capacity later as you get funding, so.
So what does it mean by, this was the only one that brings up mechanical residuals handling. What is meant by that?
So the mechanical dewatering, sorry, back to the mechanical dewatering that we had is optional on the other portion of it. This piece of land that was up here, up in the top, in the northeast corner, was where we said the solids were being put now. And so if we're gonna start to put, our water treatment plant up there, we start to assume that we need to handle the solids a different way. So that
okay.
mechanical dewatering then appears up in those options.
Okay, I got it.
All right, so moving on, so those are the alternatives, all three and kind of their sub-alternatives and what they look like. So now it's the question of, how do you go about making this decision? What are we looking at, what are we thinking about, what are we across the board there? And so, we already talked some about the risk that was associated with the different options and the predictability or unpredictability of water quality, and looked at the net present value piece of stuff. We're going to come back to these non-economic factors in just a minute, but I'm going to grab that capital cost piece now. So capital cost piece. What I have shown up here on this graph is cumulative costs of building out an alternative. So we're starting here, what's shown on the graph in the dark blue line is alternative 1. So alternative 1 was we're going to rehab as much as we can in the existing plant. And so what we're seeing here is in phase 1, so the water quality phase, what we would build for infrastructure on capital costs for water quality, somewhere about maybe 25 million on there. So that first dot. And then if we go out to phase 2, so the next dot is phase 2, this is cumulative costs. So phase 2 would be an additional 25 million in 2019 dollars, so cumulative costs coming up to 50 million now. So we're basically building it as we go up the line there. And to make this work, we had to assume some construction years on the bottom, but those are an assumed value to spread things out. So these aren't fixed yet in numbers, and everything's in 2019 dollars, but you can see the cost rising up, and in the band, there's a high band and a low band on there right now that represents that plus 50%, minus 30% that we've been talking about. So then if I want to compare that to alternative 2. So alternative 2 is the alternative where we were looking at doing incremental replacement. So incremental replacement, and got green and orange up here. And the incremental replacement, you could either do it with the pack in a plates, which is the lower dot, so the lower initial capital cost, or doing it with ballasted flock and ozone, and that's the little bit higher green dot in that initial build. And what you'll see is they kind of start to vary as you head out into the future then. So as we go to the second phase of build out, the second phase is capacity. And we said when you put in pack, you had to build more solids handling infrastructure. You had to build more of that yellow stuff to handle the solids. And so the incremental build to go up to the next phase is higher with that option. So the lines get closer together. It's less with the ozone because we don't have to build as much. Then when the infrastructure is similar, they parallel. The very end dots up here are the optional dots. So optional components being built, which is at the end we show them crossing, and this is because the lower one, the orange one, is a pack option, and then you had the option to add ozone, and so it ends up actually being more expensive in the end if you build the ozone, because you built pack originally, and at the very end we added ozone. So that's why they cross at the end, but these are optional costs off to that far right piece. So the remaining option up there, the option 3s, these were building new infrastructure. So if you go build a new plant elsewhere. And so you can see it changes the shape. You know, it's substantially higher at the beginning, higher capital cost, because we're going in and building all that infrastructure, including the chemical buildings and the clear wells and the other infrastructure that's out there. And as before with the other alternatives, your alternative that has the ozone, the alternative B, is a little bit higher than your option with pack and the plates. What you can see if you build the new plant, you do a substantial capital investment now. It's some increment up to build the other half of the plant, and then the investment flattens out a lot because you've already built everything going forward. So that's the difference in the lines up there, and just to throw in high and low bars. Oh, you want to see them. So that's how the components lay out, I guess.
I'm gonna go with the low.
One of the takeaways from some of this infrastructure pieces is for, in particular, if you look at alternative one, we're retrofitting, and you asked about retrofitting into the existing infrastructure. We retrofit in and we spend money to retrofit in, but then ultimately as we build out, it ends up being the highest cumulative cost because we spent money to build in and work on the existing infrastructure. And then when we reach end of life, we've gone and had to build new still, because that's the only way we're going to address that aging infrastructure driver. So you're pouring it in, but it becomes a sunken cost in that case because you're going to have to build new as we go out. So it's really a timing piece in looking at where it makes sense or how far you want to take existing infrastructure out. So questions about our graphs in there?
If we build, let's say we go with alternative 3B, right? We build a brand new facility. Can we use some of the, imagine I'm trying to picture, a lot of the computer equipment and the internal, any of those materials, can we use those?
So we have, because we're doing it in phases, we need to keep the existing treatment plant going and then have the new treatment plant. And even if we were going to build the whole new treatment plant, you need to have it completely in working order before you throw the switch.
Right, so it'd have to be brand new.
Yeah.
What would we do with the old space?
Well, initially we would use it through that first phase, but
Until
then
it's-
after that, it would theoretically, most of it would be past its useful life anyway, so.
But then again, come future, I mean, at least we have space to do this, that's the big thing.
Yeah, that's really appealing.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Having that space and sort
It
of
is
clear.
We've got the
Huge
park.
benefit.
And I think we drove through there, didn't we?
The
And
park, have you ever been on the
when-
park? Yeah, it's like-
Yeah, when they gave me the tour,
Yeah.
there was some police dogs out there.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Roberts area.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay. They were training.
Okay.
It wasn't because you were there, it was because, okay.
Well, I don't know, maybe. I mean,
Just checking.
could have been. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So moving then beyond the capital costs over to the non-economic portions. So non-economic criteria up here, we broke non-economic into 3 different wedges. The environmental wedge, a social wedge, kind of focused on operability stuff, and the technical wedge. And then working with your staff, we weighted the criteria on the ends. And the weighting of the criteria, you saw that the land options, that piece is already cleared and developed. So really, the environmental impacts were not very different compared to, amongst the different alternatives. So the overall weighting that got assigned to those pieces was less than pieces where you had much bigger differences in the alternatives. So the weighting does focus on, where there are big differences between your alternatives up there. So taking these weightings and going through a scoring process and looking, here's kind of the results, jumping into the end results. And what you see is, there's a couple of options in here that have much higher scores than the others. And you can imagine those are the ozone options. Largely because, on your technical side, you've got that barrier that's there consistently and has additional added benefits for your water quality and your performance. And then on the social piece, the red piece, that's an operability, reflects operability of it. So your operators, it's much cleaner, nicer, easier to operate an ozone system than it is to do the pack. Well, questions or comments on the non-economic piece? So kind of next steps are where we're going now. So that's all the analysis, lots of pieces into it. And so up next we'll be selecting a preferred alternative at some point and then breaking that down into cost items to carry forward into CIP for the master plan for the water treatment plant. And that's everything.
How long would it take to build it? Just out of curiosity, just off the top of your head.
You're probably, you could do design in, well, a year and a half. Does that sound too aggressive? But
We're not-
it
we're not-
depends on how.
Sounds good to
You
me.
guys have
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
experience.
Get her done, right?
It depends on how.
You're talking
but-
2 years or something, really.
5 to 6 years maybe overall, long from design to finish.
Yeah,
That's probably pretty aggressive.
yeah. I would
5
say
to
that's
6 years?
Mhm. From design to complete construction.
Does that seem like a long time?
Long or
Hell
short?
yes.
It's like, wait.
I'm not sure what your reaction
Well,
is.
no, I mean, it just seems like, I realize, but, the intensity of it, but, 5 or 6 years to build, it's like, oh, come on, guys. It just seems like a really long time.
So not just the build piece is only, what, 2 to 3?
2 to 3 years.
It's
Yeah.
the design process and going through all the
Permitting.
permitting and
Oh,
everything
well,
else
yeah.
is not,
Yeah.
it takes
Yeah.
a considerable amount of time.
Yeah.
And it's not, so,
Even
I mean,
if-
you can compress things, but yeah, it's not like building a house. You slop them up, so.
For perspective, the Willamette Water Supply Program, for example, is in design right now, and we hope to have that plant online by 2025. Portland is just getting started on their big water treatment plant design right now and hope to have that online by 2026. So these
So
things take time.
looking-
Permitting takes a lot of time, even on land you own.
It'd be nice to have it all done by our next 100 years, but.
What is the staff and what do you like best?
I wanna hear from you,
What's
what you
your
guys are,
preference?
yeah, good.
Well, as Ally discussed, I think there's a lot of benefits to ozone. Certainly is, as she talked about, it covers, think of the glasses in the cups in the early part of the presentation, where a lot of things are covered by that with the other technology as well. Whereas PAC is, yes, capital cost wise, it's much less, but long-term maintenance is a real issue there. And then as Todd described, that reactive versus proactive, you're kind of reacting, waiting to see what comes down the river, and then applying PAC, whereas ozone, it's that 24/7 treatment. You're getting the benefit of that all the time. But, Rob?
Yeah, Rob, what do
The
you
first
think?
step is to complete the facilities plan.
Good answer,
That's a
good
good
answer.
plan.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
If you were going to choose, Rob, which would you choose? Which would you prefer? I mean, which do you think? I want to hear what your input is.
I'm more about what it was and what it is than what it shall be. I'm limited.
You should run for governor.
Ballasted flock and ozone is a 24/7 operation, so that's where I would head.
Okay.
So So just as kind of part of the next step, so at our February work session, one of the things we talked about with the board is kind of looking at what our financial capabilities are.
Yeah.
And how do we, yeah, I mean, frankly,
What does that look like?
I'll-
What are the opportunities?
I'll tell you right now, option 3 really is an option, you know, we don't have that ability, to bond that unless you know, wanna have some horrendous
Can't you
rate
dig up
increases.
some petty cash?
Yeah, so I think this is important information, we wanted to make sure, one, I think what I was hoping to accomplish is one, make it apparent that there's a ton of information that's been worked on as far as looking at different options. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't remember,
Yeah.
how many scenarios did you guys look through?
How many cost elements?
Co-
40-something cost?
44 cost elements.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting the
Option
things
1,
that
2,
are,
3.
and keep in mind, all of these took a lot of time to go through. There's been a lot of course, staff involvement and review in how these work and so on. What we're trying to do is position ourselves, because, you know, you watch what happens in Salem. And, you know, we do a good job of monitoring for sanotoxins and stuff, but what is our true capability to address that if something's happened? And that's a concern. Taste and odor, as Ali pointed out, that's been a long-term concern that we've had, which we want to be prepared for. We also want to be prepared for things we don't know. And so some of the treatment things like ozone has a broader effectiveness as it relates to some of these other treatment things, pesticides, the pharmaceutical products. Ozone's a powerful disinfectant.
Oh yeah, pesticides wasn't in here, so it does, so it would treat pesticides.
It depends on.
Depends on the pesticide.
Depends on the pesticide, but it is, ozone's pretty much a best available technology for a
Okay.
whole suite of things.
Great.
It also looks like one of the incremental replace infrastructures to be does include an ozone system. So there is a middle ground where you can still get the ozone system without building a new plant.
Correct,
Right.
Then we go back to
Yeah.
seismic upgrades and
yeah, which.
we're in pretty, yeah, it's,
Which on the incremental, again, on the incremental, you're building brand new pieces or components that use some of the existing, and so it's just a step-by-step process to do that, so. But yes, so I think actually Rob's point is a good point, where, you know, there's still some additional analysis that needs to take place. I think you need to have the discussion at the February work session, to kind of put some dollars and cents, because frankly, that's probably gonna direct you quite a bit, as far as what the appetite would be, in order to do this. But I think at this point, with the facilities plan, we didn't wanna limit this, we wanna make sure we understood all of the options that are available, and then kind of proceed from there, so.
Will you show us in February, like, what we could do to get to a financial position
So,
for
so,
each one?
one of the things Carol's working on is trying to kinda, I call it defining the box. So, and, you know, so if you wanted to look at, gee, we want to make a X millions of dollars of investment in infrastructure, this is what it looks like from a rate standpoint. If you wanted to go
Okay, yeah,
bigger,
that's what
this
I
is
wanna
what it
see.
looks like from a
Yeah.
rate standpoint, and this is what it does too.
And potential bonds that
Right,
could
which-
be available to us.
Right,
Remembering that bonding also impacts rates.
Right,
Right.
okay.
Yep, so I think that'll be a helpful presentation for you to hear and kind of analysis to go through. And then we'll bring all of that back later. So this is not the last time you're gonna hear about this. But we wanted to, at least, there was a lot of meat to this where we wanted you to be aware of kind of some of the complexities, some of the options. And this is a good time where, you know, I mean, you can tell us how, you know, water quality doesn't matter, which I'm sure you wouldn't, but, you
We
know.
certainly should not say that.
No, you shouldn't say that. You know, so, but this is a time for you to ask questions, and if you think we're, you know, if there's a concern about, gosh, it seems like we're going too much in one direction, then that's something to identify us too, but
Well,
it is
is
an
this-
analysis.
Is this like simultaneously with phase 2, or is this like we're gonna do either one? What is,
So that's
These are
part
big
of,
projects.
right, so this is, so all I'm trying to do at this point is, you know, we did our water system master plan and that identified some costs associated with our infrastructure. One of the pieces that the board has not seen is some of the costs associated with the investments that we should be considering for the water treatment plant. And so I'm trying
like
at
a
this point,
priority.
just giving you all the information. The next presentation will then start to put some sideboards as far as here is the impact. What mix of projects get done, frankly, this is where you get to then guide us and
Prioritize.
how we do that and prioritize, yeah, that's a good way to
Or
put
you
it.
guide us and then we guide you back.
Well, and I will say that the two strategic planning meetings we've had, that topic's been brought up, both. I mean,
The
that's.
water quality?
Water quality.
Great, okay.
Making sure it gets there, that it's good enough to drink. I mean, it's, you know, like I said, most people assume that you turn on the tap and it's
Yeah,
there and it's no big
yeah.
deal. You know, they don't know how, when you start realizing you have to get it from point A to, you know, point B and everything in
Right.
between. And that was one of the things that was consistently brought up, you know, so,
Good.
you know.
All right, any more?
Anybody else? You? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so I
Holly.
think
Oh.
that, so it is 10:15 here in New York, and so if it's okay with you, I think I'm going to sign off and get the information about the update on,
You know what, Dawn?
I'm already getting tired. So I really wanted to hear this, and that's the reason I called in, but I think if it's okay with you, since it's 10:15 here in New York, I'm going to sign off for the second part of the meeting,
Okay,
so.
all right.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Bye, Naomi.
Okay, good night.
All right.
Okay, any
Thanks
other
again.
questions? Okay.
Thank you.
We needed to hear this.
Thank you so much, Ally.
Thank you,
And
yeah.
Laura and Austin for
Excellent
your input.
presentation.
We appreciate it. It was a lot to think about.
Yeah, and you did a really good job explaining. You know, you're very knowledgeable. No, not talking down to stupid people.
Well,
This is not our profession.
I know, and it's hard, yeah, it is.
So
a whole different
it's
ballgame.
stuff that we're not, we don't see.
Thank you
day to
very
day.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right, next up.
moving on. Overview of emergency preparedness. Dawn, you're up.
Woohoo!
You said you were prepared for us.
I am. That's what you pay me for, is being prepared, right?
Okay, and
For
not
emergencies.
retiring. He thinks he's gonna retire. That's
And
okay.
not retiring, is that what you
No,
said?
I told him he couldn't.
All things are subject to change without notice. So. And this is, thank you commissioners for giving me this time to talk about emergency preparedness at Clackamas Water. As I listen to the presentation, the drivers for me are, where are we gonna be 20 to 30 years down the road? What are our hazards? And I'll get into that in the presentation. I started out today over at one of our retirement homes. They did a senior fair today, and so I got to do a preparedness presentation over there, which was a lot of fun, and different audience. Dealing with people that aren't in their own home. Well, their homes are their apartments, and how do they prepare? I actually had one of the people ask me, I'm on the 4th floor, how do I get out of the building? And I says, well, if you were 35 years old, I would tell you to have a chain ladder and drop it down. But at 85, I don't think you're gonna be climbing those ladders, so, anyway.
Good advice.
Yeah, so the topics for tonight, we're gonna talk about resilience, and it's impacted in everything we touch. I'm gonna talk about some of our preparedness history to really lay a foundation of where we were, what we've accomplished so far, and then kind of where we need to go down the road. So NIMS compliance is a part of that. What are the components of NIMS compliance, and how does that affect us, and again, what we've accomplished. We're gonna talk about some of our planning efforts historically.
You're gonna explain NIMS.
Oh, National Incident Management System.
So actually, that's a good introduction. So as part of your packet, you have acronym sheet.
Yeah, I made up a
And
kind
I
of,
will warn you, there is a ton of acronyms associated with this, so.
yeah.
So it might, so it's not as part of your present, it's part of your board packet.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah, there was actually 2 handouts, thanks.
Oh my,
Tom.
yeah.
One of them, one
Exhibit
of them
2.
is, just a few of the acronyms.
It's that behind you. There you go.
And I'm sorry, I missed that one. I really try to save them even though I know they're acronyms. One of the issues of NIMS compliance is that you speak with plain language. And there's over 1,100 emergency management acronyms and terms that apply only to emergency. So,
Is that
anyway,
all?
I'm gonna talk about historical planning, the vulnerabilities, our continuity of operations plan, or COOP, and then our emergency operations plan, which is EOP. And then finally, I'm gonna discuss our risk and resilience assessment and response planning that's required as part of the American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. And you have a handout on that also in the packet, and that was produced by AWWA, and it's just really, it lays down the nuts and bolts and the basics of what we're gonna need to do. As we talk about emergency preparedness planning, our main goal is resilience, and how we can quickly recover, respond and recover to events that impact the district, whether it's man-made or human caused, doesn't matter. We want to be able to recover quickly and as easy as possible. One of the ways you do that is through redundancy, and if you're in the military folks, they get that. They go 3 or 4 deep on their ways to accomplish the same task because they know that their primary systems will fail, and it is guaranteed that they will eventually. So, preparedness history for NIMS, National Incident Management System. What NIMS is a national system for managing emergencies. It's a set of processes and procedures that gives you the capabilities. So if I go over to Beaverton on an incident response, we speak the same language, we respond in the same way. So if we need to get resources, it provides consistency across the nation. It emerged out of the national wildfire response. And that's how they respond to those types of incidents, is with NIMS and the Incident Command System. And that's ICS, if you want the acronym. So with NIMS compliance, there's 4 areas, 13 criteria, and it is getting a little late. I'm not gonna touch on all of these. If you have questions, feel free to ask. But so the general requirements are that you're gonna use the Incident Command System. So in 2006, our board signed a resolution committing the district to using the Incident Command System for emergency response. And that was outlined in our original 2002 Emergency Operations Plan, and that's one of the things we're working on an update. NIMS defines how you manage resources, so if Adam's coming into my agency to work, how am I gonna handle that? How am I gonna check him in, move him through the process, get him where he wants to go, or needs to go, and have him know what he needs to accomplish, and then actually feed him and house him and take care of him so that, he can go back to work the next day. Because that's all things we need to be able to handle it internally. And a lot of those processes are actually managed through the NIMS and the ICS process. It defines command and control. If you look at an incident organization chart, it aligns with CRW really well. There's the commanding staff, and then there's the general staff, operations, logistics, how you get stuff, planning, engineers, and finance. Finance, right? So all those come together to create a structure for managing the incident. How are you gonna communicate? There's a requirement for plain language. So when I speak to you on a radio, it's not code talk or Navajo secret talk, whatever. It's just plain language so we can understand each other. You have to have a training plan, so show and tell. So this is the CRW training plan. What we've done is outlined all the ICS courses that each staff person needs to take in order to be able to function within the Incident Command System. All of our employees take 3 basic classes, and then as you move up in the organization, and depending what your role is within that organizational structure, there's more advanced training. Right now, we've got several managers and staff attending ICS 300, and what that is basic incident management, and that's where they can learn the different processes and procedures for getting materials and moving people through the process to get it handled in the resource typing. So if I call Hugh and say, Hugh, I need a dump truck, what's your first question? Well, what size? How many tires you want on it? You know, what capacity? Well, so what we've done, we're actually in the process of redoing it. We've actually got our equipment typed, so if somebody calls us, they can say, we need a type 3 dump truck, and we know we have it, or we can say, hey, no, we don't have it. And again, there's strike teams, there's water quality teams, there's main repair teams. AWWA is, American Water Works Association, has done a great job of defining that, what those resources are. And then FEMA actually has a resource typing list, and they've kind of melded those together. So, and then how are you gonna handle information? You're gonna use a public information officer, joint information center where multiple agencies come together, and so you're sending out common messaging. And then how you're gonna deal with mutual aid. Mutual aid, what are you gonna give, and what are you gonna get, and what are the procedures and processes to be able to do that. So again, for more preparedness history, mutual aid agreements. We belong to ORWARN. It's the Oregon Water Wastewater Agency Response Network. And what that is a group of water-based utilities, water and sewer, that have pre-existing agreement for mutual aid. And then that just allows us to go to other agencies, because when you need mutual aid, what you have to do is reach laterally first. Is that horizontal, isn't it? Anyway, you have to reach to the sides first before you go up. So what we would need to do is exhaust our mutual aid agreements with ORWARN agencies where we know we could get stuff, on-call contractors, engineers, and those types of resources before we went up to the county and said, hey, we need this resource. Within the NIMS ICS system, there's a specific process for that. You know, in a form you have to fill out, it specs what you need, how long you're gonna need it, where you're gonna send it, and all those details. We also have an inter-county mutual aid agreement with Clackamas County, and also with Washington County, with the Washington County CPAC, Cooperative Public Agencies of Washington County, another acronym. Some of the other things we've done as far for preparedness is how we're engaging in the region. We work with the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization. That's kind of the overarching 5-county agency that coordinates emergency management and preparedness for the region, and they actually oversee grant funding and a lot of different things. They look at resilience planning, they look at recovery planning, and all the different phases of emergency preparedness. We belong to the Regional Water Providers Consortium. A great agency. They're just awesome to work with. I'm on the emergency planning committee. It's through that committee that a lot of the grant funding that we've been able to achieve, it started there. I also belong to the Regional Disaster Preparedness Organization, the RDPO, Public Works Group, which is transportation and people from the airport and a lot of the public works types agencies, where we come together and we talk about regional projects that we can do, disaster planning, debris planning. You know, you have a big earthquake, what are you gonna do with all the junk? Metro's engaged with that, you know, you've got all this falling down buildings, where are you gonna put it? So all this has led us to UASI grants, and again, it's another acronym. It's the Urban Area Security Initiative, and to be able to qualify for that grant, you have to do a regional THIRA, it's another acronym, Threat, Hazard Identification, and Risk Assessment. For the region, it gets ranked nationwide. Currently, I think we're 33. We just barely made the cut. That's another regional engagement where CRW is actually helping them with the process, and primarily from a water view of, gee, what is it really going to take? Should we have a Cascadia event or something, you know, some other type of event? I'm blowing through this pretty fast. Do you have any questions at this point? Good.
I'm really impressed by your ability to remember what all the acronyms mean.
I've had 8 years to learn a new language.
Wow.
And, yeah. So, and then another key piece of NIMS compliance and all of this is testing, training, and exercises. And we do a lot of that. We've done a couple of drills in Riverside Park where we hosted the event, and again, thanks to operations and the water resources, We're making kudo points in the region by using that site and having, being able to bring everybody in, because it's a great site. And it allows us to come together and actually test a lot of this equipment that we've been able to acquire through grant funding. So what have we accomplished with the grant funding? Being NIMS compliance allows us to pursue UASI grants. And when I got involved with this, one of the first things we did is we got a grant through the Homeland Security Task Force, which is with oversight from Clackamas County Disaster Management, to fund our first continuity of operations plan. Some other real highlights, we've got portable emergency lighting. One of the things we look for when we're going after this grant funding is things we might not necessarily buy ourselves, but we could use on a day-to-day basis. And so the emergency lighting, confined space air monitors for, if we have to go into a vault, we've got to check the air before we go in. One of the agencies put together a little grant project, and eight agencies got brand new air monitors to be able to do that. Variable message systems, the reader boards you see going down the road? We've got 2 of those now. And when we put that project together, Sunrise got a couple. Actually, there was 4 of us and Sunrise, and those were about 20,000 apiece.
Do you put those, are those the signs that I'll see for construction? Like those
Yes.
portable ones?
Yep. Yeah, and we've used them on some of our pipe projects as advance warning for folks, hey, construction starting in 2 weeks.
Real handy,
Yeah,
real, very useful.
it's nice.
And then, there's a couple other projects, grant projects currently going, but the last big one was the communications grant. And what that was a communications study to look at how CRW and several regional agencies should proceed with radios, portable radio communication. And it kind of set the stage for us going out and building our VHF system, because a couple of criteria that were identified was have partners and look regionally, not just a single agency. And that's what we did when we partnered with Sunrise and Oak Lodge. We were allowed, it allowed us to bring all of us together to be able to communicate when it hits the fan, and it will. So I'm going to move into emergency preparedness, continuity of operations planning, or COOP. The thing to keep in mind on COOP is that when you talk emergency planning, there's really several rings to this. So continuity of operations is focused on people, facilities, and systems, not the water system. We're talking IT and phones and those types of activities. We'll talk about emergency operations planning, which is really those things that are outside our ability to handle. They're pretty dynamic, there's a lot of damage, and we're having to look external to resolve it versus being able to deal with it internal. An example of a scenario where you would activate a COOP plan is it's pouring down rain out there right now. I couldn't ask for a better setup for this scenario. Okay, we're in a 2-story building, flat roof, the gutters have clogged, there's 3 feet of water up there. We didn't know there was dry rot in the roof. The roof cracks, floods the 2nd floor, then it floods down through, floods fax, destroys our server room. Well, how are we gonna deal with that? Okay, that's internal focus. That's what we're gonna look at. How are we gonna handle that? We're gonna activate our response team. We're gonna do our assessments. And I'll get into more details in a little bit, but that's kind of the scenario you'd be looking at. When we got the grant for the COOP planning, continuity of operations planning, we hired a consultant, and we were looking for a platform where we could develop this plan and maintain it as easily as possible. So what we ended up with was a web-based system with Bold Planning. They're based out of Tennessee. They have 3 backup locations for everything that we put on their website, and actually one of them's here in Oregon. And it allows us web access to this planning site. And the nice thing about this computerized way of doing this versus having just a Word document is if Adam retires sometime in the next 20 years, if he's listed anywhere in that plan, All I have to do is change it in one place and it actually flows through the rest of the plan, so it's kind of automatic updates all the way through. The way we maintain this plan is that we take one section, and I'm gonna go through the sections here in a minute, is we maintain one critical section a month. And so it's like eating an elephant, we're eating it one bite at a time. And again, when we did this last update, we actually reviewed everything before we actually, this is the 2020 continuity of operations plan for the admin. There's four different plans that we have, one for admin, one for fax, one for water resources, and one for operations. And the nice thing about that is as you look at the sections, they each have a little different twist within each department, and it allows them to have their own plan and know what their critical elements are, and actually get that put together in a printed document. So this is a printout, a cover of the web page that we use. You'll notice that Sunrise Water Authority is on there too. They made the decision to start doing their own continuity of operations planning, and because this system has more capacity than we need, we approached them and said, hey, why don't we partner on this? Because it's over $6,000 a year to have access to this site. And so by partnering with them, we were able to cut our annual fees in half. And so as long as they want to use it and they're actively using it, they're welcome to. If we ever have to change the website, take them off or whatever for some reason, then they would be responsible for those costs. So as you look at this, it really captures critical information. And understand, you're going to see a couple of charts in here with circles. And when you talk about emergency planning, whether it's continuity of operations or emergency operations plan, so those types of things, it's a process. You plan or assess, plan, train, test, write an after action report, and then you start all over again. That's that testing, training, and exercising we're talking about. Excuse me. So within the COOP plan, critical contacts, and this is staff, engineering firms, attorneys, board members. We're able to put all of our critical contacts in here and keep them updated. There's a teams portion, there's a response team and a support team when you talk about continuity events. It defines who those people are, what their roles and responsibilities are, and basically creates a structure for us to respond to this. And because we're NIMS compliant, we've integrated ICS into this. So as we refer to people within the support or the response team, we've actually given them their identifiers for the incident command system. So for me, I'm not only the support team leader, but I'm also incident commander. Is a simple one. Orders of succession, and this really came out of a conversation. It's something that I heard from Rusty. He asked, well, gee, if Todd's gone, who's going to take over? Well, this plan defines that. It has an order of succession for Todd, that if he's gone, it's already predefined who's going to fill in for him, and it goes to Carol and then on down the line. The next piece that's in here and that's defined, there's a delegation of authority. For us to say, hey, Carol, you're in charge. If Todd's gone, that's fine. But what the delegation of authority does is it's a signed document that we have on file. So if you come to us and we're in an event and Todd's gone, we say, Todd's already laid out his delegation of authority. And so we're going to follow those criteria for what they can and can't do. For Todd, we have two. We have an administrative one for the day-to-day, whatever needs to be done. We also have an emergency delegation, and I'm in that list. Because if we have to handle an emergency, then I have the pre-approved authority to go out and resolve it once an emergency is declared. And I have that authority to do that. We define our facilities. So we talked about the scenario before where we lost the fax area in the admin building, it's been flooded. Well, part of that is we know we have an alternate facility. If we lose this building, it needs to be updated, but we had a plan where we could redeploy folks, most of them to the operations building, and then a few staff to the water treatment plant. It means moving people around, but we could continue to function. talks about how we're gonna communicate. That's just normal communications, phone, text, email, those types of things. Security and access, how you gonna get in and out. There's a small piece of a hazard and risk assessment in this, but that's not really where that really comes into play. We do that with our vulnerability and risk assessments, and then we'll integrate it into this when that's updated. Defines mission essential functions, and that's a big reason why there's 4 plans. For operations, a mission essential function is line locates, and we have a legal requirement for a normal locate to get that locate done within 48 hours. If it's an emergency locate, it's as soon as possible. Well, that's a primary mission essential function for them, so we define what the function is, what are the resources that are required, and how do we accomplish that? What's the backup or alternative way to get that mission essential function done if you had to? And so within each of the plans, we've defined for each department their mission essential functions and what they need to do, and they're prioritized in a time frame, 0 to 24 hours, 0 to 3 days, and then up to a week. And then what are the things we'd have to do every month? Payroll's another example. We know we have to do payroll every 2 weeks. How would we deal with that? One of the things FACTS has done is they've actually got, for a lot of their computerized processes, they have backup materials stored in operations so that if something happens, like they have to cut a vendor a check, there's some checks and stamps, forms that they use on a regular basis, so we could revert back to a paper process should we lose our IT systems. Driveway kits, that's pretty typical, what's managers need, those types of things. References and authorities, won't go into that. The nice thing about this is there's a file archive. So anything we do from an emergency planning standpoint, critical documents, critical forms and all those types of things, we can store those in the file archives. And then no matter where we're at, if we've got internet access, we can get those forms. So, what else are we gonna talk about? Our emergency operations plan. So, our original emergency operations plan was written in 2002. It's been on my things to do list for years. Also, our vulnerability assessment was done about that time. And those have been on my radar since I got moved into emergency management. It's good. The good news is that I'm this close to having an updated emergency operations plan done. The basic plan's finished. There are several annexes to it that integrate the ICS information. There's the forms that you would use to actually handle an incident is one of the annexes. There's also job aids. So what the long-term goal is, these are general right now, the long-term goal is to update those job aids, so if you come in to help us in an incident, not that board members would actually be out helping us, but somebody from outside comes in and says, hey, you're incident commander, the job aid allows you to give them, it's kind of a general outline of what they would need to do, what their responsibilities are, what forms are they responsible for, and what processes, and how to actually go about the planning. So, and we have those for all of our primary positions that are within the incident command structure. Some of the stuff that's in the main plan itself, authorities and references. Why do we do emergency planning? The 2006 resolution, something that's referenced in there. The emergency operation plan defines roles and responsibilities. Our concept of operations, how are we gonna do what we need to do? What's our priorities as far as damage assessment? How are we gonna do the damage assessment? Those types of things. How do we activate? How do we declare emergency? What does our response look like? Again, this has been an interesting process. We're that close. I've got 2 of the 4 annexes done. Started on the 3rd annex, which is mutual aid. Again, defining the procedures so that we have it captured in our own documents. And then equipment typing, which won't take a lot of work. We just have to find the time to do it. So, next step for CRW. In the budget, we referenced the American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. There's two phases to it. There's a risk and resilience assessment. They're calling it a risk and resilience assessment now, and really it's almost like our vulnerability assessment that we accomplished in 2002. The processes are similar. So really we're gonna be looking to update that. Phase 2 will be the development of an emergency response plan. Now, the world according to Don, you've got your COOP plan for internal, your emergency operations plan, which is a 60,000 or 30,000 foot view of how you're gonna handle emergencies. Your emergency response plan, or ERP, is your helicopter view, where you're actually looking down and seeing, okay, here's the real thing, here's the big picture, here's how we're gonna handle it, basically how we're gonna handle it and respond. The next piece of that will be hazard-specific emergency response plans. And God forbid that we should use the water plan. But that would be part of this process where we develop a plan that if we do have an earthquake and lose the plant, how are we gonna respond to that? Because you're not gonna recover the plant overnight. Thank you, Rob. You're not gonna recover the plant, you know, you're talking a year and a half. So, and I've actually been thinking about this one. So what does that emergency response plan look like? Well, let's get a temporary pump, or temporary treatment plant, put it in the park, pump water up someplace, and get it out into the system, if the plant's not operational. That's part of the reason we've gotten some of the emergency equipment we've got, the emergency water treatment trailer, and those types of things. But anyway, that's kind of the other piece, and it's really a cascading emergency operations, emergency response, hazard-specific plans. And that's where this risk and resilience assessment is headed, because it leads to the emergency response plan that requires you to actually define the equipment and procedures and things you can do to mitigate whatever may come. The assessment has to be all hazards. That's kind of a term that's evolved. In 2002, the big thing was terrorism. Everything had to have a terrorism nexus. And that's still true for grant funding today. But they've opened that up to look at natural and man-made hazards, earthquakes, floods, storms, cyber issues and all that. It has to take into account resilience, and part of the assessment will look at our critical assets and compare those to the hazards that we face, and you create what's called an asset pair, and then that analysis will actually you have to look at what are the mitigation measures that we can take to minimize the impact of those hazards on that critical asset. It's going to look at pipes, systems, phones, software, IT. Cyber is going to be a huge portion of it, because every day we're getting hammered, and kudos to Cum. She does a great job of protecting her systems, or the people she works with. But that's part of the assessment that we have to look at. What are our vulnerabilities, and how do we mitigate them? Looks at system monitoring, treatment, storage, and again, you define all your critical assets, look at all the hazards you may face, create threat asset pairs, and figure out how you can minimize the impact. So, the risk and resilience assessment, really we're going to answer the question, what can go wrong, what is the likelihood that it's going to go wrong, and then what is the consequence? And they actually look at everything from fatalities to just a loss of economy. The bottom line is for water, is we look at what we have to do in the future. If we're not ready for the Cascadia quake, how are we going to recover the region? Because the impact is huge economically, especially when you look at our huge water users. You know, how long can they be without water before they have to relocate or not come back? And I think it's like 90 days. It may not even be that long. Excuse me. You know, how many small businesses can go without water for 30 to 60 days and be able to survive?
Well, that will shut down Starbucks.
Yeah. So, I've kind of talked about this already. It's asset characters. So the process that we used is RAMCAP, again, another acronym. Risk Assessment Methodology for Critical Asset Protection. It's a defined process. I've talked about all this, and it really is, it's a vulnerability analysis looking at assets, threats, consequences, and vulnerability to come up with some numbers that, and ideas for how you can mitigate. I think I've pretty well covered this. Part of this, we're, at the end of the 7th piece of the 7-step RAMCAP process is you're gonna take the analysis, apply the mitigation measures, and then you're gonna recalculate your risk. And then as part of that, there's a cost-benefit analysis. Because if you spend $1 million to mitigate a $200,000 risk, well, why not just insure it? So we're gonna look at those to see what's the payback, should we invest in this? What's gonna be the outcome of this process? It's a guide to improve resilience, and hopefully the long-term outcome from this will be a hazard mitigation plan. And that's separate from what we've been doing. It's something for the next budget cycle or down the road. And the reason that we want to take it to that extent is we're talking about spending millions and millions of dollars over the next bunch of years for resilience. If you have a hazard mitigation plan for your agency and you get it adopted by Clackamas County, which means they integrate it into their hazard mitigation plan, which they're required to have, well, that qualifies us for hazard mitigation grant funding. And there's more and more money coming out all the time to build resilience into the system. So if we build a water line and 25% of it, we know it's coming, backbone project, 25% of that cost is resilience, then we could apply for federal grants to help offset the cost of the project. And that's my long-term vision for where this needs to go. So the emergency response plan is gonna look at the highest hazards and the critical assets. We have to have a response plan for that. That just makes us better able to respond, and that's the whole purpose of that emergency response plan. One of the things that we're dealing with is that the risk and resilience assessment is required to be done by December 2020. We just issued an RFQ, request for qualifications, about a month ago. And we got 6 proposals back to do this risk and resilience assessment and develop our emergency response plan and get the high level help that we need to get this done. And then the RRA, risk and resilience assessment, is due December 2020. In the RFQ, we've asked for that to have that piece done by September. And then we're gonna be negotiating the timeline for the emergency response plan. I just talked with the contractor today, and we've set up a meeting for this week to start defining the scope and the details of what this project is gonna look like. One of the things that happened was that when we originally did this, this was kind of a new process for folks, and kind of the best guesses from the engineers was this project would cost about $150,000 total. If you look at the timeline, we thought we were in category 3, and that was from the AWWA fact sheet that I gave you guys. And what we learned was that our population is not just CRW population. You have to include concurrent systems. Okay, well, we sell water to Sunrise. That puts us over the 50,000 population for a timeline, so we lost 6 months. We thought we were going to be able to budget for the emergency response plan in the next budget cycle. So we're gonna be working with the contractor. Don't know what the costs are right now. Our approach is to really try and do as much of this in-house as we can to keep the cost down, but right now we don't know what's gonna happen. We could be under 100, we could be more, but until we'll come back once we have an idea. You'll need to approve the contract, so. Any questions that I can answer for you? It's almost 8 o'clock.
Don't worry about it. No, wow.
So,
Welcome to my world.
so
I'm
you
impressed.
can tell Don speaks emergency management for a while. He knows that that language. I think the things that I'm encouraging the board to be aware of is one, the American Water Infrastructure Act. That's a federal regulation that we have to comply with. All the water systems are in this bill right now, and so you're going to hear a lot about that in the region. The important thing is we are working on it. We have a timeline. We got a little bit of a curveball with the way they interpreted the rule initially versus the way it was interpreted later after we did our budgets. So we may need to come back to you with respect to there may be an additional budget request in the future. You will also soon hopefully see a contract with a consultant for us to do that work. So that's kind of one piece. The other piece I want is Don held up some things with respect to training plans, and I just want you to be aware that we should take the training serious. All the staff has had for ICS 100, 200, and 700 training, and so we're all compliant in that regard. And then there's a lot of additional training that takes place, so we're trying to get scheduled out as well. And then some of the documents. Really hoping we can show the new
New coup.
we have the new coop.
This little document here is this is one of the annexes. This is the forms, ICS forms. Most of those are acronyms. And there is that. It's a copy of the org chart, and what you have here, this is the job aids that will go into, and this is the 2002 Emergency Operations Plan. And it was written by they contracted with the city of Portland to write this. And I did this in-house, at least this piece of it,
So we should have by 2020, we'll have the new coop. Well, we already have the new updated coop, we'll have the new emergency response plan. We'll continue to work on our training, and in the meantime, we're also working on the American Water Infrastructure Act compliance. So a lot still going on, so I just want to make sure that the board's aware of that. One thing that is helpful, Don's really good about providing information in your monthly management updates that are included in the board packets. And so it's easier to take it in a bite-sized chunks. That's kind of the progress and stuff, so I really appreciate him adding to that. And it's a good way to even look into past packets and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And one caveat on this is that I've had this reviewed by Clackamas Fire and Clackamas County Disaster Management, and we got a thumbs up.
Good job.
But what I don't fully understand is when we get down to the emergency response plan level, will it require an update to this? Because there may be information in here that's better placed in the emergency response plan. So that's why it's gonna be nice to have the consultants that have done a lot of these to help kind of guide us down that path. So,
Don, I appreciate all the time that you put into this, obviously.
And I will,
Awesome.
so yes, Don's awesome spearhead on this, but I do not want to lose sight of the fact that there is a considerable amount of other staff.
Right.
We have what we call our EPIC team, for example, that goes through the COOP plan, we take a section every month. So it is truly Don mentioned a number of times, the involvement had come with respect to the IT, obviously Adam and Rob with respect to our infrastructure, and then Carol as far as the finance and do that stuff. And
yeah,
all the other staff are involved too, so.
I couldn't do
truly
what
is
I
a
do
team
without
effort.
the support of the EPIC team. And there is a representative from each department on that. And that's kind of the approach we're gonna take with the WEA project, is we're gonna use the EPIC team to reach out to those departments for the information and try and do the heavy lifting on this if possible.
Excellent
Okay.
job, you guys. I'm impressed.
I'm
I'm
tired.
overwhelmed, but I'm impressed. Nice job, Don.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions, comments to, no? All right, then I am Commissioner Communications? Yeah, I don't think so. No? No, okay. We'll do ours Thursday. Number 4, Todd, General Manager update.
All right, I'll keep this brief, but there are a few things I want you to be aware of before our next board meeting. One, just as far as the strategic planning update, we're kind of entering in that home stretch of our research phase, which will complete in about mid-February for the strategic planning process. We have one final focus group that will be held the evening of Monday, February 10th at 6 p.m. here. Thank you to those that participated and were able to participate in the last focus group that we had. I thought it went well. We're also going to be closing the customer attitude survey at the end of this month. So Carol provided me, said we're up to 553 responses. So I think that's a pretty good response rate. The next step then after we conclude our research phase is our consultant, Shelley Perini, will then be gathering all this information, and then she will kind of synthesize and provide an update to the board at your March 12th board meeting. So she'll be present to give you a little bit more in-depth overview of where things are at. And then it all culminates with the strategic planning retreat that's on April 27th.
Now, who
So-
comes to that?
So it'll be all the board members, management team, and then we'll also probably have 3 additional staff members that will be participating in
Oh,
that
darn, I was
process.
hoping the CFO of Oregon City would come. He's kind of cute.
The who?
No.
CFO of Oregon City?
That's,
Chief
all right, hey, we digress.
What's his
Okay,
name?
I'm gonna try to get through
Wyatt.
this.
Wyatt Parnell?
Um,
I saw him today.
So, I do want to welcome, we welcome a new engineering associate, Anthony Steele, who's started at CRW. He's actually been at CRW for the past 4 months as a contract employee, but we were able to convert him into a full-time staff person. So we're very excited to have his addition. I know Adam's really excited to have his addition.
2 thumbs up.
So yeah, he's already been deep in it as far as working on some projects and stuff, and been helpful. The other thing I just want to mention is that the Water Environment Services has a new stormwater outfall in operation. Now you might be wondering, why in the world am I bringing this up and who cares? But this has actually been a project that's been several years in the making. And the reason it's significant is because, one, it's a stormwater system that actually goes through our property down by the water treatment plant and discharges right above the boat ramp. Now, the good news is prior to that point, the discharge would have been above our intake. Now, the discharge from the stormwater is below our intake. And so that's obviously a real benefit as it relates to water quality. Now, given the fact that it is just above the boat ramp, we've already noticed that there's a little bit more interest in public awareness as far as they see water coming out of this outfall, and we actually had one instance where there was an oil sheen associated with that when we had to have Wes come out and boom off the system and control that. But my point is, and the reason I think it's important for you to know, is because it is an improvement that helps with the discharge, again, moving it from above our intake to below our intake. And it's a stormwater collection system that's for a good chunk of the industrial property. So that's a nice thing to have. I'll give you more of an update as it relates to the Oregon legislature and the fact that they're convening a short session. There are a few water-related items of interest. I just heard that you actually received an email. So if you do receive that stuff, it would be helpful if you let me know. We do, just as a reminder, we track all of this information through Special Districts Association of Oregon. I actually serve as the chair of the legislative committee and as their water representative as well. And so we're in constant contact with their lobbying staff, and they keep us abreast of what's going on.
Do you want us to forward that to you?
Yes, I would like to see that.
Okay.
So I think I have it already, but I just want to see what
Yeah, I
he
was
said
gonna bring it up
to
Thursday.
you. And then just as far as meeting schedule, just a real quick reminder that this Thursday is the agenda prep meeting with Commissioner French and Commissioner Garrison. Do you have any flexibility on meeting a little earlier?
Earlier would be fine.
Okay, so we'll coordinate with Commissioner Garrison and see if we can move that
Okay.
meeting maybe just a little bit
We'll just
earlier.
move ours.
I'm trying to make a 1 o'clock training is my challenge.
Oh.
So,
We can move ours to another day.
Oh,
No, well,
If
no.
we can,
No, 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 no,
We have
no,
plenty of time, we're not going
It's-
until next week. We were gonna
Can we-
meet before that to talk about
when we're
the
leaving and
conference,
all that
but
kind of
we've
stuff.
got
That's
plenty
it.
of time.
Yeah.
all right,
We
well,
will reschedule.
that's a great segue, SDAO conference will be held next week, and so,
Are
so.
you getting 4 days away from my family?
Woo-hoo.
Let's see, I already mentioned the February 10th focus group, and just a reminder that we have our regular board meeting on Thursday, February 13th. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is we will probably need to have an executive session prior to the meeting, so I'll be talking to the agenda setting committee to talk about maybe meeting at 5 p.m. to start that meeting. If that's a problem, this would be good to know. We have, would like to start the meeting at 5 p.m., quickly recess into an exec session, and then come back at a time certain, 6 p.m., to start your regular meeting, so it'll be, so people who normally show up. Chris doesn't have to show up till 6 o'clock then, unless he wants to sit in an empty room, that's fine.
Some of my best work.
TMI, Chris.
The
TMI.
13th, that is
February,
fine by me.
Thursday, February
Yeah.
13th, so we'll talk more about that, but that's at least the plan for now, and I'm done. So.
Okay, anything, public comment? Anything? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned. Thank you for coming.